I've always loved solo camping. There's something about being out in the wilderness with no one around, just me and nature. Clears my head in a way nothing else does. I usually sleep in the back of my car because it feels a little safer than a tent, but I've done both. I've never had any real problems. I keep some form of protection on me at all times, never tell strangers where I'm staying, and I always listen to my gut. Last fall, I planned a weekend camping trip in a national forest about 3 hours from home. I had been there before and knew a few good dispersed camping spots. It wasn't hunting season, and the area wasn't very popular, so I figured I'd have the place mostly to myself. Perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, driving down the winding dirt roads deeper into the woods. I passed 1 or 2 cars near the more developed campgrounds, but once I turned onto the more rugged paths, I didn't see anyone. I drove another few miles, checking out a couple of possible sites before settling on one tucked back off a narrow side road. It was a large, flat clearing surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space to park my car and set up a small fire pit. There were no other campsites nearby, no signs of recent activity. It felt secluded but not too isolated. After setting up camp, I cooked some food and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. As the sun set, the forest took on that eerie stillness that always makes me feel both peaceful and on edge. I was used to the normal sounds, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, but something about that night felt different. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I got into my car for the night, locking the doors and making sure my knife was within reach. I had a small setup in the back, an air mattress, sleeping bag, a lantern, and my gear tucked neatly beside me. I scrolled through my phone for a bit, checking maps and weather, then settled in. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard movement outside. It wasn't the wind or the random creaks of the forest. It was slow, deliberate. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. My car was parked so that the back was facing the densest part of the trees, while the front faced the dirt road I had driven in on. The footsteps sounded like they were coming from the woods behind me. I stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a soft scrape against the side of my car. Not loud, just enough to know something or someone was there. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't see anything through the dark windows, and I wasn't about to turn on a light. I reached for my keys, slowly, trying not to make any noise. I didn't want to panic and drive off without knowing what was out there, but every instinct in me screamed to leave. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. I waited, gripping my keys, barely breathing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Eventually, the forest seemed to settle again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every small noise made me jump. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally exhaled. I stepped out of the car, scanning the area. Nothing seemed disturbed, but as I walked around to the back, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal tracks. They were barefoot, large, and deep. Someone had been standing just feet away from where I had been sleeping, watching. I didn't waste time packing up. I threw my gear into the car and got out of there, checking my mirrors constantly as I drove. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a person passing through. Maybe it was something else. But I do know one thing, I haven't been back to that spot since. And I never sleep as deeply when I camp alone anymore. I have been solo camping for years. It started as a way to get out of the city, to disconnect from the noise and chaos of everyday life. I never thought much about it being dangerous. My mom took me camping when I was a kid, and I never grew up afraid of the outdoors. I had lived in rough neighborhoods as an adult, so being alone never scared me. I was comfortable doing things by myself. The idea of solo camping being risky never really crossed my mind until I started reading about other people's experiences online. I had a few standard rules. I avoided busy campgrounds where drunk groups might be hanging out. I always let someone know where I was going. I kept a knife and my car keys next to me when I slept, and I trusted my gut. If a place felt off, I left. It had always been enough to keep me safe, until that one trip. I had planned a weekend in a national forest, somewhere remote but not completely off the grid. I had been to the area before and never had any problems. It was late fall, and I expected the campground to be empty, which was fine by me. I wanted the quiet. The drive was uneventful, and when I arrived, I found exactly what I was looking for. A secluded spot near a small creek, surrounded by thick trees. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the evening. The first night was peaceful. I cooked over the fire, listened to the wind in the trees, and read for a while before turning in. I slept well, only waking once when I thought I heard something moving outside my tent, probably an animal. I fell back asleep quickly. The next morning, I took my time making coffee and breakfast, enjoying the crisp air. It was still early when I decided to go for a short hike. I had a trail map, and I chose a loop that would bring me back to camp in a couple of hours. About halfway through the hike, I noticed something strange. There were boot prints on the trail, fresh ones. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived, and the campground had been empty. But someone had been here recently. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a hunter or another camper passing through. But then I saw something else. A cigarette, but still slightly smoldering, discarded near the trail. I stopped walking. My stomach dropped. Whoever had left it had been here minutes ago, but I hadn't seen anyone. No sound of footsteps, no voices, nothing. I turned around and walked back toward camp, moving faster than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the woods were empty. When I got back, everything at my campsite was just as I had left it. No signs that anyone had been there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual, trying to push back the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. I ate quickly, my ears straining to catch any sound beyond the crackling of the fire. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no rustling in the trees. It was the kind of silence that made my skin crawl. Then, just past the reach of the firelight, I heard it. A single footstep. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Then another step. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. I strained my eyes, trying to see past the darkness, but the fire only lit up so much. Another step, closer this time, then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping my knife, staring into the blackness beyond my fire. Nothing moved. Eventually, I forced myself to breathe, to act. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the treeline. Nothing, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against my truck, my knife in one hand, my keys in the other. The fire burned low, but I kept it going as long as I could. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was already packing up my gear. I loaded everything into my truck, double-checking to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind. I wasn't wasting any time. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I turned to pull out of my campsite, I glanced at the spot where I had heard the footsteps the night before, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints, fresh ones, leading right up to where I had been sitting. My blood ran cold. Someone had been there, watching me, standing just feet away from me in the dark. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, the trees far behind me. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I've been camping my whole life and never had a problem with men in the woods. They say hello and keep moving on their way. I mean, be smart. I wouldn't choose to solo camp somewhere that is known for partying, for example. But most people who camp are good people. Think of it this way: if you're a man looking to hurt a woman, are you going to the middle of the woods and hoping one comes by? Doubtful. Every time I've solo camped, my main concern was wildlife, since one person makes less noise to scare them off. That was until my last solo trip. I had chosen a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated campgrounds. I always preferred dispersed camping. No noisy neighbors, no rules, just me and the wild. The drive-in was long, the dirt roads rough and barely maintained, but I liked it that way. It meant fewer people would bother coming out this far. I parked my truck in a clearing and hiked in about a mile, finding the perfect flat spot near a small creek. The air was cool, the scent of pine thick around me. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. The first night was uneventful. I cooked, ate, and listened to the sounds of the woods. An owl hooted somewhere nearby, and small creatures rustled in the underbrush. I was used to that. It was normal. I slept deeply, undisturbed. The next day, I spent time exploring the area, keeping an eye out for animal tracks. I found signs of deer, raccoons, even a few bear tracks near the creek, but nothing fresh. Still, it put me on alert. I made sure my food was properly secured and kept my bear spray close. The rest of the day was peaceful. I read a book by the creek, enjoyed the quiet, and felt completely at ease. That night, something changed. I had just settled into my tent when I heard movement outside. Not small animals, something bigger. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk. I listened, heart pounding, as the footsteps grew closer. They were slow, deliberate. I reached for my knife, barely breathing. The footsteps circled my tent. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the handle of my blade. Then silence. Minutes passed. I couldn't hear anything but my own breathing. Slowly, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, or maybe an animal passing through. I finally drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I found tracks around my campsite. Not boot prints, not paws. Something in between. Large, wide, with deep impressions in the dirt. My stomach dropped. I forced myself to stay calm, rational. Maybe it was just a bear with an odd gait. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I decided to stay another night, but I kept my fire bigger and stayed more alert. As the sun set, the uneasy feeling returned. The woods felt too quiet. Then the footsteps came back. Closer this time. Heavy. Deliberate. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. My fire crackled, casting long shadows, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. The footsteps circled again, pausing just outside the light. And then something moved, a dark shape, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, hunched, its limbs too long. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It watched me. I could feel it. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it slipped back into the darkness. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going until dawn, every muscle in my body tense. As soon as it was light, I packed my gear and left. The whole hike back to my truck, I felt eyes on me. I never saw it again, never heard it, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I've done a lot of solo camping, probably more solo camping than trips with other people. It's something I truly enjoy, even with the occasional unsettling moment. For me, the good always outweighs the bad. There's something freeing about being alone in nature, with no schedules, no obligations, just you and the wilderness. If it's something you think you might enjoy, I'd say go for it. But there are things to keep in mind. I usually avoid official campgrounds. The biggest reason, other people. Strange as it may sound, the worst and scariest part of camping can be the other campers. Neighbors playing loud music all night, groups of people who get too drunk and rowdy, or just the discomfort of having strangers too close to my site. Instead, I stick to dispersed camping on BLM land or deep in national forests. No designated sites, no reservations, just a quiet place where I can set up my tent far from anyone else. Car camping is another solid option. If anything ever feels off, I know I can just throw my gear in the back, hop in, and leave in minutes. It's a safety net that helps me relax. And while I don't often worry about wildlife, bear spray is a must. It works on more than just bears. Most of my trips have been peaceful, but there was one that changed how I approached solo camping. One that reminded me that even in the deep woods, humans are still the biggest threat. I had picked a spot in a national forest, a few hours from the nearest town. It was a place I had been to before, remote, quiet, perfect for a few nights of solitude. The dirt road leading in was rough, barely maintained, but my truck handled it fine. I parked at a small pull-off, loaded up my gear, and hiked about a mile in. I found a spot just off a small stream, set up my tent, and got settled. The first night was perfect. The air was crisp, the fire crackled, and the sounds of the woods were calming. I slept well, only waking once when I thought I heard something moving outside my tent. Probably just an animal, I told myself, and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, things felt off. My gear wasn't how I had left it. My pack was unzipped, though I was sure I had closed it before bed. Some of my supplies were shifted around, but nothing was missing. It didn't look like an animal had gotten into it. There were no claw marks, no torn fabric, just an unsettling sense that something or someone had been there. I brushed it off and went about my day. Hiked a bit, fished at the stream, enjoyed the solitude. But as the sun dipped lower, that uneasy feeling returned. The woods felt different, quieter, like something was just beyond the trees watching. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my heart pound. At some point, I heard soft footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving around my camp. Not an animal. Too steady, too careful. I lay there, gripping my knife, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. My breath caught. I stayed frozen, listening. Then, just as quietly as they came, they retreated. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as there was light, I packed up. I was ready to leave. But as I made my way back to my truck, I saw them, footprints. Not mine, fresh, leading to my campsite and then back into the woods. I don't know who was out there, and I don't want to, but I haven't camped in that spot since. And now, even deep in the wilderness, I always keep my bear spray within reach. I've been solo camping for years. It started as a way to get away from everything, to disconnect and just be in nature. But over time, it became something I truly loved. The solitude, the freedom, the ability to set my own pace and do exactly what I wanted without anyone else's input. It was refreshing. Of course, I was always aware of the risks. Being alone in the woods, especially as a woman, meant I had to be extra careful. I trusted my gut, I stayed prepared, and I always had my car key and a knife close when it came time to sleep. This particular trip was supposed to be like all the others. I had planned for a weekend away, heading deep into a national forest where I wouldn't be disturbed. I picked a spot near a stream, about a mile off an old dirt road. There were other campers in the area, but not too close, just enough to make me feel secure without being crowded. I set up my tent, got my fire going, and settled in for a peaceful night. The first night was calm. The usual sounds of the forest filled the air: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush. I fell asleep easily, but when I woke up the next morning, something felt off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I noticed the small things. My backpack, which I had zipped up, was open. My cooking utensils were moved. My water bottle was lying on the ground a few feet from where I had left it. Nothing was missing, just disturbed. It wasn't the work of an animal. Raccoons would have taken food. A bear would have made a mess. This was different. It was like someone had been there, going through my things, but with no real intent to steal. I felt uneasy, but I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe I had just been careless. Maybe I hadn't zipped the backpack all the way. I brushed it off and went about my day. I hiked a little, read by the stream, cooked a meal over the fire. As the sun started to set, the unease crept back in. That night, I lay in my tent, listening. First, everything seemed normal. But then, just past midnight, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around my campsite. I held my breath, gripping my knife tightly. The footsteps circled, stopping near my tent. I could hear breathing, deep, measured. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away. The next morning, I checked the area. No boot prints, no obvious signs of a person, but I knew what I had heard. I had camped alone for years. I knew the difference between an animal and a person. And I knew, without a doubt, that someone had been watching me. I decided to pack up. As much as I loved solo camping, my gut told me it was time to leave. I hiked back to my car, glancing over my shoulder the whole way. When I reached the dirt road, I spotted something on my windshield, a single, smudged handprint. I didn't wait around. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove until I was back on the main road. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I haven't solo camped since. I've been solo camping for about 10 years. It's always been my way of unwinding, getting away from everything for a bit. I never really worried much about safety, at least not in the way other people seem to. My mother always worried, though, so a few years back I got a dog, mostly for her peace of mind. The only real problem I ever had was other campers playing loud music or, one time, a goose that tore through my stuff and stole some grapes. I trusted my gut, and if I ever got a bad feeling about a place or the people around, I packed up and found somewhere else. It was simple, but this trip, this one changed how I looked at things. I had picked a secluded area in a national forest. No marked campsites, no trails nearby, just deep woods. I wanted quiet, and I knew this spot was perfect. It was about a 3-mile hike from where I parked my truck, down an old logging road and through thick trees. My dog, Hank, a big German Shepherd mix, trotted beside me as we made our way in. The sight was great. A clearing just big enough for my tent, surrounded by dense trees. A small creek ran nearby, which meant I had water. I set up camp, built a fire, and cooked a quick meal while Hank sniffed around. The first night was peaceful. The fire crackled, the air was cool, and the stars were bright. I listened to the usual sounds of the woods, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. Hank curled up close to the tent, relaxed but alert in that way dogs always seem to be. At some point in the night, I woke up. Hank was standing at the entrance of the tent, ears up, body tense. I listened. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear the usual night sounds. No crickets, no rustling, just silence. Hank let out a low growl, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the camp. Then I heard it, a single footstep, not an animal, not the quick, light movement of a deer or a raccoon. This was slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath. Another step, closer. Hank growled again, louder this time. The sound came from the edge of the clearing, just beyond where the firelight reached. I pointed the flashlight in that direction, but the beam only hit trees. Nothing there, but I knew something was. I stayed still, waiting, listening. The woods remained silent. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the darkness. I didn't sleep much after that. Hank stayed by the tent entrance, ears perked, body tense. Morning came, and I tried to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. Maybe it was another camper, someone wandering through. Maybe they saw my site and left when they realized it was occupied. That was the logical explanation, but it didn't sit right with me. I checked the area. No boot prints, no signs of anyone having been there. I tried to brush it off. I spent the day fishing at the creek, cooking over the fire, and just enjoying the peace. But that uneasy feeling never really went away. The second night, I kept the fire going longer. I stayed up later, listening. Hank was restless, pacing the edge of camp. Then, just like the night before, the woods went silent. Hank froze, stared into the darkness. The footsteps came again, slow, heavy. But this time, they didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They came closer. I grabbed the hatchet I kept by my side. Hank bared his teeth, growling deep in his throat. My heart pounded. The firelight flickered, casting moving shadows across the trees. And then I saw it, a figure, just on the edge of the firelight. too far to make out details, but close enough to see it was standing there, watching. I gripped the hatchet tighter. My breathing was shallow, controlled. Hank growled again, louder this time, and then the figure moved. Not away, closer. I stood up fast, raising the hatchet. Hank lunged forward, barking, snapping. The figure stopped, hesitated. Then it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I packed up what I could, grabbed my essentials, and started making my way back toward the truck. I kept the flashlight moving, scanning the trees. Hank stayed close, ears back, body low. The hike back felt like it took hours. Every noise, every shadow put me on edge, but I never saw anything. I never heard the footsteps again. When I reached my truck, I threw everything in the back, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The headlights lit up the road ahead, but the forest behind me was pitch black. I didn't look back. I drove straight home. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know if it was just another person or something else. But I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. And if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, alone, and the forest goes quiet, leave. I had been camping alone for years. It was my way of clearing my head, a break from the noise of everyday life. The woods had always felt peaceful to me. There was something about the isolation, the simplicity of it all. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. But my last trip changed everything. I had chosen a site deep in the national forest, far from any marked trails or designated campgrounds. I had done my research, mapped out the area, and planned to stay for 3 nights. The drive took me down winding dirt roads, past the last known camping spots, and farther until the road itself was barely visible. I parked my truck, packed my gear, and hiked in about 2 miles. The site I picked was perfect, flat ground, a small clearing, and a nearby stream for water. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and settled in. The first night was uneventful. The fire crackled, the air was crisp, and the usual sounds of the woods surrounded me. I slept well, but when I woke up, something felt off. Some of my things had been moved. My backpack, which I had zipped up, was open. Some items were scattered around. Nothing was missing, but it was as if someone or something had gone through them. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe even a bear, but nothing was damaged. It was just disturbed. I brushed it off and went about my day. I fished at the stream, caught a few small trout, and cooked them over the fire. The day was good, but as the sun started to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started noticing things. The usual sounds of the woods, birds, insects, felt distant. The rustling in the underbrush wasn't random. It was measured, intentional. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening. At some point, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy. They stopped just outside my tent. I gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag and stayed completely still. The footsteps lingered, then moved away. I waited, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn before unzipping my tent. Outside, I found tracks. Not boot prints, not animal tracks. They were large, human-like, but wrong. I spent the day close to camp, my senses on high alert. I checked the perimeter, looking for signs of whatever had been outside my tent, but the dense forest floor made it difficult to track. Still, every so often, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. That night, I built my fire larger than before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets, no rustling, just the fire's crackling. Then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps, moving just beyond the fire's glow. My heart pounded. I tightened my grip on my knife. Something was out there, watching me. The figure was just beyond the light, tall, hunched. It moved in a way that wasn't natural. It circled my camp, just out of view. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going until dawn. As soon as it was light enough, I packed my gear and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. The entire way I felt it, something following me. I never saw it, but I knew it was there. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat gripping the wheel. My hands were shaking. I looked back toward the tree line, half expecting to see something staring back. But there was nothing. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had been camping alone for years. I never thought much of it. It was a way to clear my head, to get away from everything. I liked the quiet. No phone, no people, just me and the woods. It was always peaceful, until that last trip. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any official campgrounds or hiking trails. I had done my research, studied the maps, and knew how to find my way back. The plan was to stay 3 nights, do some fishing, and just enjoy the solitude. I had done it plenty of times before. I drove down the old dirt roads, past the last known camping areas, then even farther until the road itself was barely visible. I parked my truck off to the side, loaded up my gear, and hiked in about 2 miles. I wanted to be deep enough that I wouldn't see another person the whole trip. The spot I chose was perfect: flat ground, a small clearing, and a stream not too far away. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything ready before dark. The first night was uneventful. The air was crisp, the fire crackled, and the usual sounds of the woods filled the night. I slept well, but the next morning something felt off. When I woke up, I noticed things weren't where I had left them. My backpack was unzipped, though I was sure I had closed it before going to sleep. Some of my supplies were scattered. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, maybe even a bear, but nothing was torn up or missing. It was like something had gone through my things but didn't take anything. I brushed it off and went about my day. I fished at the stream, caught a few small trout, and cooked them over the fire. It was a good day, but as the sun started setting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, rustling in the brush. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just random noise. It was deliberate, like something moving with purpose. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening, waiting. At some point, I heard it, footsteps, not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, heavy. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, just as slowly as they came, they moved away. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal prints either. They were large, too large for a person, but shaped like something that walked on 2 legs. I tried to shake the feeling of dread that crept up my spine. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the day close to camp, not venturing far. I checked the surrounding area, looking for more tracks, but the forest floor was too dense in most places to see any clear imprints. Still, every so often, I would get the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. That night, I built the fire bigger than before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at a distance. I ate quickly, staying close to the flames. The forest was quieter than usual. No crickets, no distant rustling, just the occasional crackle of my fire. Felt wrong, too quiet. Then I heard it again, the same slow, deliberate steps moving just beyond the tree line. My heart pounded in my chest. The firelight only reached so far, and I couldn't see anything beyond the glow. But I knew it was there. I tightened my grip on my knife and stayed as still as possible. The footsteps circled my camp, stopping every so often. Then something moved closer. I could just make out a dark shape at the edge of the light. It was tall, too tall for a person. The way it moved wasn't natural. Its silhouette was hunched, its limbs long and strange. Stayed there watching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, after what felt like forever, it turned and slipped back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed up my gear and started hiking back to my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being followed. I moved as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My hands were shaking. I looked back toward the tree line, half expecting to see something standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had been camping alone for years. I never thought much of it. It was a way to clear my head, to get away from everything. I liked the quiet. No phone, no people, just me and the woods. It was always peaceful, until that last trip. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any official campgrounds or hiking trails. I had done my research, studied the maps, and knew how to find my way back. The plan was to stay 3 nights, do some fishing, and just enjoy the solitude. I had done it plenty of times before. I drove down the old dirt roads, past the last known camping areas, then even farther until the road itself was barely visible. I parked my truck off to the side, loaded up my gear, and hiked in about 2 miles. I wanted to be deep enough that I wouldn't see another person the whole trip. The spot I chose was perfect: flat ground, a small clearing, and a stream not too far away. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything ready before dark. The first night was uneventful. The air was crisp, the fire crackled, and the usual sounds of the woods filled the night. I slept well, but the next morning something felt off. When I woke up, I noticed things weren't where I had left them. My backpack was unzipped, though I was sure I had closed it before going to sleep. Some of my supplies were scattered. My first thought was an animal, a raccoon, maybe even a bear, but nothing was torn up or missing. It was like something had gone through my things but didn't take anything. I brushed it off and went about my day. I fished at the stream, caught a few small trout, and cooked them over the fire. It was a good day, but as the sun started setting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing things, branches snapping, rustling in the brush. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods, but something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just random noise. It was deliberate, like something moving with purpose. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening, waiting. At some point, I heard it, footsteps, not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, heavy. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like forever. Then, just as slowly as they came, they moved away. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt. They weren't boot prints. They weren't animal prints either. They were large, too large for a person, but shaped like something that walked on 2 legs. I packed up my camp right then. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I hiked back to my truck, checking over my shoulder the entire way. I didn't see anything, but I knew I was being watched. I could feel it. When I got back to my truck, I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. I still don't know what I saw or almost saw that night, but I haven't camped alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had always loved camping alone. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, away from everything, that made me feel at peace. The stillness, the quiet, the fresh air. It was the best way to reset my mind. I never worried about being out there by myself. I was careful, I had experience, and I had never run into anything I couldn't handle. That changed on my last trip. I had picked a spot deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far from any established campgrounds or well-traveled trails. It was one of those places you had to find on your own. No signs, no parking lots, just a narrow dirt road that eventually faded into the forest. I had researched the area, checked the weather, and packed everything I needed. I planned to stay for 3 nights, do some hiking, maybe some fishing if I found a good spot, and just enjoy the solitude. I got to the site late in the afternoon. The place was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by thick trees, close to a creek. with plenty of dry wood for a fire. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and got everything ready before the sun went down. As I sat by the fire that first night, I felt completely at ease. The woods were quiet, aside from the usual sounds, crickets, the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the brush. Nothing out of the ordinary. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was cold. I listened. The woods were completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. That kind of silence wasn't normal. Even at night, there was always some kind of noise. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves somewhere beyond the trees. It was heavy, whatever it was. Not a deer, not something small. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart started pounding. I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, or maybe a bear, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It was too slow, too deliberate. I lay there for what felt like forever, listening. The steps circled my campsite, stopping every so often, as if whoever or whatever it was watching, waiting. I didn't move. Eventually, the steps faded into the distance, and the normal sounds of the forest slowly returned. I stayed awake until the sun came up. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. Nothing looked disturbed, but I found something in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. Tracks. They weren't from a bear or a deer. They were large, almost human in shape, but the toes were too long, the nails sharp like claws. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had never seen tracks like that before. I considered packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself it was just my nerves. Maybe I had imagined the sounds. Maybe the tracks were just from some animal I wasn't familiar with. I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to let a little paranoia ruin my trip. That day, I hiked further into the woods, trying to push the unease from my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I would stop and listen, convinced I heard something moving behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. The woods felt different, wrong. I had spent enough time alone in nature to know when something wasn't right. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to camp. I built up the fire bigger than the night before, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at a distance. I ate quickly and stayed close to the flames. Then, just as the last light of day disappeared, I heard it again. The same heavy footsteps, moving just beyond the trees. But this time, there was more than one. I gripped my knife and tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps circled my campsite, slow and deliberate. Then something stepped closer. I could just make out the shape, a figure standing at the edge of the firelight just beyond the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. The shape of it was wrong. It stood on two legs, but its posture was hunched, its head too large, ears pointed like a wolf's. Then it moved. It stepped closer, and I could see its eyes reflecting the firelight, glowing. It wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I had ever seen before. It was something else, something I didn't have a name for. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. It stood there, staring at me, and then it let out a low, guttural growl that sent a chill through my entire body. The air felt thick, heavy. I gripped my knife tighter, knowing it wouldn't do anything against something like this. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going until the sun came up, my eyes locked on the tree line, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. As soon as it was light enough, I packed up my camp and started the long hike back to my truck. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. When I finally reached my truck and locked the doors, I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. I had no explanation for what I saw. I still don't. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. I don't camp alone anymore, and no matter how many times I try to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that it was just an animal, I know the truth. There's something out there, and I never want to see it again. I decided to go camping alone for a weekend, deep in a national forest about 3 hours from where I lived. I had done plenty of solo camping before, and I enjoyed the peace of being out in the woods with nothing but the sound of nature around me. I wasn't looking for anything extreme, just a quiet few days away from everything with some fishing, hiking, and maybe a little reading by the fire at night. I picked a spot that wasn't near any of the designated camping areas. It was off a dirt road that wound deep into the woods, a place I had marked on a map months before but never visited. The spot was near a creek, with plenty of flat ground for my tent and a clearing just big enough for a fire pit. I arrived late in the afternoon, set up my tent, and gathered firewood before the sun started going down. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the sounds of the woods, and stared up at the stars. It was the kind of quiet that you only find in places far from people. No cars, no distant hum of a highway, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle from an animal moving through the undergrowth. I slept well, wrapped up in my sleeping bag inside my tent, with the fire outside burning down to embers. The next morning, I got up early and decided to explore a little. I hiked along the creek, following its winding path through the forest. I found animal tracks along the banks: deer, raccoon, and something else I couldn't quite place. It looked almost human but was too big and too narrow at the same time. I told myself it was probably just a weird impression in the mud and kept going. I spent most of the day hiking and fishing, catching a few small trout that I cooked for dinner. As the sun set, I gathered more firewood, making sure I had enough to last the night. It was colder than I expected, and I wanted to keep the fire going as long as I could. That night, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the woods seemed quieter than they had the night before. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. I sat by the fire, trying to shake the feeling, but it lingered. Then I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking, coming from the trees behind my tent. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I turned my head and listened, waiting for another sound, but there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something larger moving through the trees. I stayed by the fire for another hour, watching the darkness beyond the trees. I kept hearing little noises, rustling, occasional cracks of branches, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I felt uneasy. When I finally decided to go to bed, I made sure the fire was still burning strong. I got into my tent, zipped myself inside my sleeping bag, and listened. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves outside my tent. I held my breath. It wasn't the sound of a small animal. It was heavier, like something walking on two legs. My heart started pounding. I reached for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag and stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped. For a long time, I just lay there listening, barely breathing. The fire outside cast a faint glow through the fabric of my tent, but I couldn't see anything beyond that. I stayed awake for hours, waiting for another sound, but none came. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first. The fire had burned down to embers. The trees stood still and silent in the morning light. But then I saw them, footprints in the dirt. They were large, larger than my own boots, but narrow, almost unnatural in shape. They led from the trees to just outside my tent, stopping only a foot or two from where I had been sleeping. My stomach turned. I packed up my camp quickly. I didn't eat, didn't take time to enjoy the morning, just shoved everything into my backpack and took down my tent as fast as I could. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. I hiked back to my truck, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. I didn't see anything, but the feeling never went away. The drive home was quiet. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't do anything but focus on getting away from that place. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was another person, though I don't know why they would have been creeping around my tent in the middle of the night. I've camped alone since then, but I never went back to that spot, and I never will. I had been solo camping for years. It started as a way to clear my head, a break from everything, work, people, noise. I loved the quiet, just me, the trees, and the open sky. No obligations, no distractions. I always picked remote spots, far from official campgrounds and crowded sites. The deeper in, the better. I never had a reason to be afraid. Not really, until this last trip. I had planned a 3-night stay in the national forest, far beyond where most people ventured. I spent days studying maps, finding a place that looked untouched. The plan was simple: hike in about 5 miles, set up camp, fish in the nearby creek, and just enjoy the solitude. The drive to the forest was long, mostly dirt roads cutting through miles of dense trees. I turned off the main road onto an old, overgrown path, barely wide enough for my truck. I went as far as I could until the road became impassable. From there, I loaded my gear onto my back and hiked in. The spot was perfect. A small clearing nestled between thick trees, with the creek just a short walk away. No signs of other campers, no trash, no fire pits, just untouched wilderness. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and took in the silence. The first night was peaceful. The usual sounds of the woods filled the air, wind rustling through leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I sat by the fire, cooked my dinner, and watched the flames dance. When I turned in for the night, I slept deeply. The second day was uneventful. I fished in the creek, caught a few trout, and spent the afternoon reading by the water. It was everything I had hoped for until dusk. As I walked back to my campsite, I got that feeling. The one you get when someone is watching you. I stopped, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The woods were still, almost unnaturally quiet. I told myself I was imagining it, that I had just spent too much time alone. But the feeling didn't leave. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. The crackling flames gave me comfort, their light pushing back against the darkness. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, leaving the fire smoldering. I woke up suddenly. Something had snapped a branch outside my tent. A heavy, deliberate step. My breath caught in my throat. I listened, straining to hear past the pounding in my chest. Another step. Closer. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My tent walls were thin, offering no protection. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then silence. Whatever it was, it had stopped just outside. Minutes passed. I wanted to unzip the tent, to look, but I was paralyzed. Eventually, I heard slow, retreating steps. It moved away, vanishing into the night. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers. Everything looked the same except for the footprints. Large, human, barefoot. The tracks circled my camp before disappearing into the trees. I wanted to believe it was some lost hiker, someone who stumbled upon my camp and left. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. No one hikes barefoot through this kind of terrain, and no one just stands outside a tent in the middle of the night. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was watching me. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and sat there, catching my breath. I looked back at the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. I don't know who or what was out there that night. But I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. I've been camping alone for years. It's always been something I enjoyed. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I never really saw it as dangerous. If you prepared properly, trusted your instincts, and avoided risky areas, you were usually fine. The biggest threat was always wildlife, and even then, most animals wanted nothing to do with people. That's what I believed. That's what I told myself every time I packed up my gear and set off into the wilderness. But this trip changed the way I see solo camping forever. I had planned a weekend trip deep in a national forest, far away from any designated campgrounds. I wanted the kind of solitude you couldn't get with neighbors nearby. I chose a spot that was off any marked trail, about 4 miles from where I parked my car. It wasn't my first time camping in an area this remote, so I knew what I was doing. I had my gear, enough food, water, and a GPS to navigate if needed. I wasn't worried. The first day went as planned. I hiked in, found a nice clearing near a small creek, and set up camp. The air was crisp, the sounds of nature were comforting, and I felt that familiar sense of peace settle in. I spent the afternoon gathering firewood, setting up my sleeping area, and just taking in the scenery. By the time the sun dipped below the treetops, I had a good fire going and was cooking my dinner. Everything was perfect. The first night was uneventful. I slept soundly, only waking up once when I heard something moving in the brush. Probably a deer or some other small animal. I didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed and ready for a day of hiking and exploring. After a quick breakfast, I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a knife, just in case, and set off. I followed the creek for a while, then veered off to check out some rock formations I had spotted the day before. It was a good hike, peaceful. I didn't see another person, which is exactly how I liked it. But when I got back to camp, something was off. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. My tent was still there, my fire pit undisturbed. But then I noticed my sleeping bag was unzipped and partially pulled out of the tent. That was strange. I was certain I had zipped it up before leaving. My backpack, which I had left inside the tent, was sitting outside now, its top unbuckled. I stopped where I stood, scanning the trees around me. My immediate thought was a bear, but nothing had been torn apart or chewed on. My food, which I had stored in a bear-proof container a short distance from camp, was still intact. This wasn't an animal. I felt my skin prickle as I slowly walked to the tent. I checked my gear, but nothing was missing. Someone had been here, but they hadn't taken anything. They had just looked. That was somehow worse. I tried to shake it off. Maybe another camper had come through, saw my stuff, and got curious. Maybe they thought the site had been abandoned. It was unsettling, but not enough to make me pack up and leave just yet. That night, I built my fire bigger than usual, letting the flames push back the darkness. I ate my dinner with my knife close at hand, listening for anything unusual. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves were muted, like everything was holding its breath. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I turned in earlier than usual, locking my car keys in my pocket and keeping my knife within reach. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound put me on edge. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the scurrying of a raccoon. These were slow, deliberate, human. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tight my knuckles ached. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The fabric of the tent was thin. I knew that if someone wanted to get in, there was nothing I could do to stop them. My heart pounded so hard I was sure they could hear it. Minutes passed, then more. The footsteps didn't retreat, but they didn't come closer either. Whoever was out there was just standing. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, but eventually, the footsteps moved. Slow, measured steps circling my tent once, twice. Then, finally, they faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, gripping my knife, ears straining for any sound. When the sun finally rose, I crawled out of my tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard, and I wasn't sticking around to see if they'd come back. I packed up my camp in record time, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. The hike back to my car was the longest of my life. When I finally saw my vehicle, I nearly ran the last few yards, tossing my gear in the back and locking the doors the second I was inside. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, I felt something strange. I should have felt relief. I was safe. I was leaving. But all I could feel was the weight of unseen eyes still watching me from the trees. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I don't think I ever will. had been solo camping for years. It was something I did to clear my head, to escape from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant connection to the world. I left it all behind when I packed up my truck and drove out to the middle of nowhere. This trip was no different. I had picked a spot deep in a national forest, about 10 miles down a rugged dirt road, far from any official campgrounds. I wanted solitude. No car campers with their blaring radios, no rowdy groups getting drunk around their fires. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived late in the afternoon, pulling my truck off the narrow road and into a small clearing that looked like it had been used as a campsite before. There was an old fire ring made of stones, some flattened grass, and the remains of charred logs from whoever had been there last. It was perfect. After setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and organizing my gear, I settled in for the evening. The air was crisp, the sky a deep orange as the sun dipped below the treetops. I made a simple meal, sipped some coffee, and let the silence of the forest wrap around me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up once to the sound of an owl calling in the distance, but other than that, it was just the normal sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the occasional crack of a twig, the soft whisper of the wind through the branches. The next day, I decided to do some exploring. I followed a faint game trail that wound deeper into the forest, moving carefully, making note of landmarks so I wouldn't get turned around. After a few miles, I stumbled across something odd. There was a structure, not a cabin, not a hunting blind, something in between. It looked old, abandoned. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof partially collapsed, the door hanging off its hinges. A small pile of bones sat just outside the entrance. Animal bones, I told myself, probably just some hunter's old shack. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I didn't go inside. I just stood there for a moment, listening. The forest around me felt too quiet. I turned back, walking a little faster than before. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was lower in the sky. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just an old structure, nothing more. But that night, I slept with my knife closer to my sleeping bag, just in case. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not the quick, skittering steps of an animal. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife. My truck was parked about 15 feet away, my keys inside. If I moved fast enough, I could probably make it. But I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps lingered for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as slowly as they had come, they moved away. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every noise made my skin crawl. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I crawled out of my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the ground near my tent was softer, and I could see the clear imprint of boot tracks in the dirt. I packed up faster than I ever had before. As I drove out of the forest, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But I didn't. I don't know who was out there that night. Maybe just some drifter. Maybe a hunter who stumbled across my camp by accident. Maybe something else. I still camp alone. But now I always trust my gut. And if something feels off, I leave.